It was the summer of 1945, and the war in Europe had been over for less than 3 months. British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart had been granted access to something no journalist, no politician, and no Allied general had been given. Time alone with the men who had tried to stop us. He traveled through prisoner of war camps and military detention centers across occupied Germany with a notebook and a single question. Not what went wrong for Germany. Every defeated general in history has an answer for that. Liddell Hart was asking something far more uncomfortable. He asked them what went wrong for us. What would have beaten you faster? They answered without hesitation, and every single one of them said the same thing. To understand what they revealed and why it has never been fully reckoned with, you need to go back to the late summer of 1944 and see what the German army actually looked like from the inside. By late August 1944, the German army in France was not retreating. It was disintegrating. The Falaise pocket had been a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured. Tens of thousands more were lost in action. Equipment losses were absolute. Tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles littered the roads for miles. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of the Western Front. He was Hitler's troubleshooter, the man sent to fix every disaster. What Model found made his stomach turn. He had fragments of units, soldiers without weapons, officers without men. His entire force had roughly 100 operational tanks. The Allies had 12 armored divisions ready to attack. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the forge that built their weapons, lay virtually undefended. Model had nothing to stop a concentrated thrust. For 3 weeks in September 1944, Germany was defenseless. The soldiers racing across France could feel it. For the first time since D-Day, they could smell the end. Some believed they would be home by Thanksgiving. They did not know that the brakes were already being pulled from a desk hundreds of miles away. Patton reached the Moselle River, the last major water barrier before the German border. His tanks were 100 miles from Germany. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, delivered assessment after assessment. The Germans were finished. Their army was broken. One concentrated push would end it. Model was desperately scraping together whatever he could find. Old men from reserve units, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, rear echelon clerks who had never fired a rifle in combat. He was building a defensive line out of desperation and prayer. Every day the Allies delayed, Model got stronger. Every week gave him more time to rebuild. The window was closing. On September 1st, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces. He faced a decision that would determine how the war ended. Concentrate everything on one axis and punch through to the Ruhr, or advance on multiple fronts simultaneously and squeeze Germany from all directions. The concentrated thrust was the aggressive option. Pick your best commander, give him everything, let him run. If it worked, the war ended in weeks. Patton wanted it. American doctrine supported it. German defenses could not stop it. But Eisenhower was not just a general. He was managing an alliance, and the alliance was fracturing. Montgomery wanted priority in the North. Churchill was pressuring Roosevelt to give British forces a larger role. Montgomery, who had never been shy about his opinion of anyone, threatened to go over Eisenhower's head directly to Churchill if he did not receive the fuel and resources he was demanding. The political crisis that would follow could have shattered the coalition entirely, and Patton was politically impossible. The slapping incidents in Sicily had made him radioactive in Washington, giving him supreme operational authority, publicly elevating him above Montgomery, above Bradley, above every other Allied commander, would have caused an uproar that Eisenhower could not contain. The same quality that made Patton the most dangerous offensive commander in the Allied Army made him the one man who could not be seen to win it. Eisenhower chose the broad front, not because he did not understand the map, because he understood the politics. It was the price paid to keep the coalition together. Patton's Third Army ground to a halt in the first week of September, not because of German resistance, because of empty fuel tanks. And when Eisenhower had to choose who got priority, he chose Montgomery. Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to support Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine in Holland. He promised it would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower gave him the fuel, the transport aircraft, and the priority that Patton's army had been begging for. Patton told his staff they were handing the Germans exactly what they needed. Time. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation of the war to that point. It failed catastrophically. The British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded at Arnhem. Of 10,000 men who landed, barely 2,000 escaped. The rest were lost or captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The war would not end by Christmas. As the remnants of the 1st Airborne waded back across the Rhine, the tragedy was not just the men lost in the forests of Arnhem. It was the fuel that was not in Patton's tanks. The momentum gambled on a shortcut that led to a dead end. Walter Model could not believe his luck. In the first week of September, he had nothing. A broken army, no reserves, no defensive line. He had reported to Hitler that the situation was hopeless. Then the Allied advance slowed. It stopped in some sectors. The concentrated thrust he had feared never came. Model worked frantically. He pulled units from quiet sectors. He activated every reserve formation in Germany. Day by day, the West Wall came back to life. By late September, he had a defensive line. By October, he had reserves. By November, he was planning a counteroffensive. The Allies had given him 6 weeks. 6 weeks to rebuild an army from wreckage. 6 weeks that should never have existed. What followed was some of the bloodiest fighting the American army experienced in the entire war. Hurtgen Forest. American forces fought through dense woodland for nearly 5 months for terrain that could have been bypassed entirely. 33,000 casualties in the first phase alone, eventually climbing toward 55,000. 19-year-olds in frozen foxholes, fighting for every yard of a forest that did not need to be taken against an enemy that should have already surrendered. The Siegfried Line was taken by bloody frontal assault because it had not been outflanked when it was weak. Every casualty had a name. Every death produced a telegram to a family back home. Then in December, the Germans launched their last major offensive through the Ardennes. The attack succeeded initially because Eisenhower's broad front had left defensive positions thin. There were no reserves where they were needed. 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. 19,000 dead. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the entire European theater. This was the offensive that Model had spent the autumn preparing. This was what the 6 weeks of September and October had bought Germany. Time to rebuild, time to plan, time to launch one final desperate counterattack. And then Liddell Hart sat across from the men who had watched all of this happen from the other side. Field Marshal von Rundstedt did not waste his words. He said that in the first 2 weeks of September 1944, the German defensive line in the West was not a defensive line at all. It was a fiction. Broken divisions were wandering the countryside trying to find their own units. The Siegfried Line was barely manned. In some sectors, a determined Allied infantry battalion could have walked through without significant opposition. He said the broad front strategy had been a gift to a German army that had no right to survive September 1944. Not a threat, a gift. He told Liddell Hart exactly what the Allies should have done. Concentrate a powerful striking force and break through to the Ruhr. Such a breakthrough, he said, together with air domination, would have torn the weak German front to pieces and forced Germany's collapse. General Blumentritt called it a gift. Von Manteuffel called the broad front strategy fundamentally wrong. General after general gave the same verdict. The Reich had been given a second lease on life because the killing blow never came. When Liddell Hart asked which Allied commander the Germans had feared most, the accounts pointed consistently toward Patton. The American style of warfare, with speed, aggression, armored thrusts, and relentless pressure, was what German commanders said had come closest to destroying them. And that was exactly what coalition politics had suppressed. One captured German officer described the Allies as fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Germany and one against each other. Germany only had to survive the Second War long enough to rebuild for the first. Liddell Hart published these interviews in 1948 in a book called The Other Side of the Hill. It caused almost no official reaction from the Allied military establishment. The generals who had made the decisions being critiqued were still alive. Several were still in uniform. The institutional appetite for examining whether different decisions in September 1944 might have ended the war 6 months earlier was essentially non-existent. But there is a second problem with this account, one that Liddell Hart never fully acknowledged. The German generals who praised his strategic thinking and condemned Eisenhower's decisions were not dispassionate analysts. They were defeated commanders sitting in Allied custody, facing possible prosecution, hoping for rehabilitation, and talking to a sympathetic British historian who had his own thesis to advance. Historians who later examined the interviews noted that the generals told Liddell Hart almost precisely what he wanted to hear, including claiming, conveniently, that his own pre-war writings had influenced their military thinking, claims that no contemporary documentation supports. Their testimony about the September 1944 window of vulnerability is corroborated by German records, but their certainty that a concentrated Allied thrust would have ended the war quickly is the assessment of men with every reason to offer it. The debate itself is real. Historians continue to argue about the broad front versus concentrated thrust question, based on logistics, supply lines, and Allied air superiority. The strategic window in September 1944 was genuine. German records confirm it. The choices Eisenhower made had consequences that American soldiers paid for through the autumn and winter of 1944. But the German generals did not hand Liddell Hart an objective verdict. They handed him an argument that suited them, filtered through a conversation designed to produce exactly that result. Between September 1944 and May 1945, the United States Army suffered approximately 200,000 killed and wounded in the European theater. The men who fell in the Hurtgen Forest at the Bulge along the Siegfried Line, they died in a campaign that the men on the other side of the wire said was unnecessary. Whether those men were telling the complete truth is a harder question than Liddell Hart asked. Eisenhower kept the alliance together. That was his job, and he did it. But keeping the alliance together was not the same thing as ending the war as fast as possible. History remembers him as the man who won the war. The German generals remembered him as the man who let them survive the autumn. And the men who recorded those German accounts had reasons of their own to present that verdict as the final word. There is a difference between a commander who wins a war and a commander who ends one as fast as possible. Whether those German assessments close that argument or simply complicate it is a question that historians are still working through.